Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the BEEc Speaker Series. This will be our last talk, and the BEEc Speaker Series will reconvene again in fall 2025. So just a little bit about BEC. BEC is the Center for Bee Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation at York University. We are an organized research unit, and if you'd like to learn more about us, you can visit our website at www.yorku.ca/bees, or you can email me, the BC coordinator, at vc@yorku.ca. We are an initiative that strives to advance research in the fields of bee ecology, evolution, and conservation. BEC's mission is to foster interdisciplinary, innovative, and collaborative and cutting-edge research to advance our knowledge on bees and implement policy changes in order to help sustain pollinators globally. Our goal is to apply our collaborative efforts to the development of policies and environmental management for the long-term sustainability of bees and the vital ecosystem services they provide. If you would like to learn more about BEC, you can join our listserv by sending an email to listserv@yorku.ca and have a line in the body of the email stating subscribe bees along with your first name and last name. You will then be added to the listserv, and then you'll be notified of any upcoming programming, receive a monthly newsletter, and reminders for any future events. If you are a York University researcher or collaborator, you can contact me for more information about applying to be an associate. Our associates are interdisciplinary researchers. They are also community members that are highly involved with bee research, education, public outreach, as well as policy management. And you can see here there's a small selection of our BC associates. Today's event is called the BEEc Speaker Series. It's a program which we run once a month, usually the second or third Friday of the month, always at 11 a.m. EST using the Zoom platform. Here is an image of our previous speakers for the year, and many of these talks are available on our website for viewing. So feel free to visit www.yorku.ca/bees and then /speaker-series to learn more about this program. And later on in the fall, you can also register for new upcoming talks. A few logistics for today. So we are using the Zoom platform, and only panelists can turn their camera and microphones on. We ask that you please use the Q&A box to pose questions to the speaker, and we will pose the questions back to the speaker at the end. Use the chat box sparingly for any general comments, as it can be distracting for the speaker to continuously having notifications pop up. If you're experiencing any issues, you can send a private message to myself or email to bc@yorku.ca. And if you need to leave at the hour mark, we are still in the Q&A period. Do not worry, this presentation and the Q&A session will be recorded and posted later on after the contents of the talk are published. So the talks are also posted on our YouTube at youtube.com/@beesyork. We have several previous talks already available on the YouTube channel to view. We also have talks posted from other programs like the BEC Associate Series, as well as BeeCon, which is our annual conference. You can subscribe to the channel and be notified when we have new videos posted. And before we begin the talk, I would like to recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. If you'd like to know or learn more about the history of land that you come from or where you are joining us from today, this website is a fantastic resource for this exploration. It was a Canadian initiative, but now it has worldwide coverage. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Jane Heffernan, a professor at York University. She will be introducing our guest speaker today, Dr. Matthias Becher, and she'll be leading the Q&A session afterwards.
Thank you, Catherine, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be welcoming Dr. Becher to the BEC seminar series. As you know, I'm more interested in modeling and the quantitative and qualitative analysis of the behavior and infection of bees. And so super interested in hearing more about Behave, which is a agent-based model that Dr. Becher developed. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Becher, and you can feel free to get started.
Yeah, thank you, Jane, for the invitation and the kind introduction. Can you hear me actually?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. And you see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yes, welcome everyone, and yeah, good afternoon, or rather, good morning for most of you. And yes, today I will talk about my work, about bees, social bees mainly, and modeling of bees. Yeah, if I mention that I work with bees, most people will immediately imagine or think of honeybees. But actually, there are, of course, many more bee species apart from the single species Apis mellifera. So we have the bumblebees, which is a larger group. And of course, we have thousands of solitary bees. Apart from those, we also have actually several species of honeybees. So it's not just Apis mellifera. There are 8 species, most of them native to Asia. And in the tropics, we have many stingless bees. But today I will focus on the social bees, honeybees, and bumblebees. Why are bees interesting? Why am I interested in studying them? Well, because they are social insects, and yeah, social insects are just really, really cool. Apart from that, bees are also important pollinators, and they are not only important pollinators for in terms of ecology, but also in terms of economy. So clever people have done the maths and came up with the value of pollination, and it's a pretty impressive number. But on the other hand, bees are not necessarily doing particularly well. So it's been on the media for quite a number of years now that bees are declining, and they're not necessarily doing particularly well, at least some or many species of the bees. So in order to understand, or there are different reasons why bees are in decline, and these different reasons are also different for different bees. So it's not just a single cause that causes the decline of bees, but there are many different reasons. And you probably have to distinguish the honeybees, which are mostly kept by beekeepers, from the other bees. And yeah, for honeybees, reasons why that cause problems can be invasive species, like the varroa mite, for example, that is a parasite which transmits viruses. Quite recently, or a few years ago, the yellow-legged hornet is spreading in Europe, and a few years ago it arrived in Germany and it's causing more and more problems here as well. Diseases can be a problem, particularly if they are transmitted by the varroa mite, like the deformed wing virus. But also intensified agriculture is a challenge for the bees because forage can be reduced and pesticides may be applied, which might not be particularly helpful for the bees. Bad beekeeping is another reason why honeybees, which are kept by beekeepers, may not do particularly well. Of course, beekeepers can be helpful, but if they are unexperienced, if they make mistakes, it can be devastating for the colony. So in the end, there are social economic reasons explaining the numbers of honeybees that are present. On the other hand, if you look at wild bees, they are not kept by beekeepers. They are free living and have to take care for themselves. And here, mostly the loss of habitat, nesting habitat, foraging habitat, is one of the major reasons why they potentially struggle. Also, they seem to be more susceptible to pesticides. And also commercial bees like honeybees or um, invasive bumblebees can cause problems either because of competition for resources or because these bees can spread again, diseases and kill the native bees. contexts. For example, the bumblebees can be a problem in Asia and South America. And also climate change can cause problems, and particularly if a mismatch develops between phenology of plants and pollinators, so that the flowers are in the plants are in flower when the pollinators are around, and the pollinators are around when the plants are not flowering, and both species then suffer from that. So potentially a lot of things that affect the population dynamics of the bees, and if you want to study them and better understand what is going on, traditionally you would do some field work. So you place some, for example, honeybee colonies in the environment, you do some experiments, you check how well the colonies are doing. The advantages for those proper fieldwork experiments is that you work with the whole colony and in a natural environment. On the other hand, there are also some disadvantages. Those type of experiments is usually quite expensive. It takes quite a lot of manpower, which also means that the sample size is rather limited. And also because the experiment takes place in a natural environment, and the honeybees can forage up to 10 kilometers in the extreme case. You really lack control of where the bees are going, what is around in the landscape. You can't control the weather conditions and things like that. On the other hand, you could do lab studies. Advantages here are that you work in a controlled environment. Experiments are usually reproducible, but then you have the disadvantages that it's usually a really artificial environment, and you work with individual bees or just small groups of bees. Of course, you can also choose a mixed approach and do some semi-field or tunnel studies, and to combine the advantages. You have a more or less controlled environment. You can work with the whole colony, but unfortunately, you also combine the disadvantages. So it's not really fully controlled. It's not a natural environment. But apart from those types of experimental work, there's also another approach, and that is modeling. And today I will focus on the modeling approach to study bees. So what actually is modeling? Obviously, we are not talking about fashion here, but we talk about scientific modeling. And a model is basically a representation of a real system. Models are always simplified, but they contain the relevant features, and relevant really depends on the question you would like to address with this particular model. So each model, in order to be useful, has to have a specified purpose. Models can be relatively simple and just a mathematical equation or two equations like this Brighton model, Bumblebee model from 2013. They can also be pretty complex computer programs like the BumbleBehave model we developed. The benefits of modeling is, although they cannot really produce empirical data in contrast to experimental work, they can at least show the consequences of our assumptions, and then here suggest whether or not our assumptions make sense. They can help us to understand complex systems, and they can show what potentially could be the case. It doesn't mean that it actually is the case, even if the model shows patterns that we see in reality. It doesn't mean that the mechanism is in the model is the same as the mechanism in reality, but at least they show how it could potentially be. They can provide hypotheses and hence guide experiments and make experiments more efficient. And models are, in comparison to fieldwork, relatively cheap, and they are quick to run, at least once you've developed them. Developing a complex model, of course, it can be a big project. So usually we used about 3 years, needed about 3 years for the development, documentation, and publication of the model, sometimes even longer. And last but not least, models can also be great tools for communication and for teaching and communicating and discussing research questions. So today I will talk about bee models and the bee models I was involved developing, and that's on the one hand the Behave model, which is a honeybee colony model. On the other hand, we have the bumblebee population Behave model, bumblebee population model, and as a third model, We have the Bee Scout model, which is a landscape model and provides input files for the bumblebee and the Behave model. Let's start with the Behave model. When I started work on that project back in 2010, that was my first postdoc position I had. I went from Germany, where I studied and did my PhD, to the UK to work with Juliet Osborne at Rothamsted Research. And the project I was involved in as a modeler, we also had experimental work and lab work going on. But me as a modeler, my task was to develop a complex bee model. And we are interested in better understanding how factors outside of the hive, like landscape, beekeeping, weather conditions, things like that, and factors inside the hive, egg laying rate, division of labor, viruses, and things like that, parasites, how they all act together and affect the population and colony dynamics of the honeybees. And for that, I then developed a relatively complex bee model called Behave, and it is composed of 3 modules. We have the colony module, and that covers all the processes, or at least all the processes we were interested in taking place within the hive. So things like egg laying, brood care, consumption of resources, mortalities within the hive. We have a second module, the foraging module, where the bees interact with the landscape to collect nectar and pollen. And this module is informed by the Bee Scout model, which can read in maps and define how much nectar and pollen actually is available, which then feeds into the model. And we have a Varroa module where we simulate the dynamics of the Varroa mite and also the transmission of viruses, deformed wing virus or APV, and simulate the effects on the bees. And these models were implemented in NetLogo, which is a quite easily accessible platform for agent-based modeling, and which is freely available. And the models themselves are also freely available on our website. So if you are interested, have a look at the Behave website. Yeah, if we look a little bit deeper into the details of the in-hive processes, actually the main driver of the population or colony dynamics for the honeybees is the egg laying rate in the model. It follows a kind of bell-shaped curve, which can be adjusted to seasonal variations. From the eggs, after 3 days, the larvae hatch and larvae need feeding. They develop then into pupae, and pupae then finally into adult worker bees or into adult bees. And for the worker bees, we distinguish between the in-hive workers and the foragers. And the in-hive workers have to do all the tasks inside the colony. We focused on the nursing. And from the number of in-hive worker bees available at the moment, we can derive how big the brood nest can be at that day. At a certain age, which is flexible and reflects the colony situation and the needs of the colony, these in-hive workers will develop into foragers, and these then start to explore the landscape and collect nectar and pollen. And during the summer months, we also consider drones. They don't really contribute to the work, and in reality, they are only there for mating, which is actually not covered in the model, but they are interesting for the simulation of the Varroa dynamics, because Varroa mites like to invade the drone cells and reproduce there. We also then have specific mortalities for all of these different stages. So daily background mortalities for eggs, larvae, pupae, and bees inside the hive. And additionally, we have foraging mortality for those bees going foraging. We have an additional mortality for larvae if there's not enough pollen or protein available for those, reflecting the cannibalization of eggs and larvae in the bees. And we have effects of virus infection. Also, at the end of each year, we check if the colony is big enough to survive the winter. So there's a threshold. We set it to 4,000 adult bees, and if it's at the end of the year, the colony is too small, we assume they will die during the winter. And of course, if the honey stores are below zero or reaching zero, then the whole colony will starve due to die due to starvation. And once a day, the foraging module is called. At the beginning, I assume that all the forager bees are inside the colony, they are resting, and then with a certain probability, they might leave the hive and search for food sources. If they find a food source that seems or is suitable for them because it offers nectar or pollen, and they're after these food sources, then they will exploit it. They collect a full load of nectar or pollen, and then they try to fly back. On their way back, I then actually determine whether or not they survive that foraging trip, and that is based on the total time the bees spend foraging outside. If they don't die, they return, and then they might start dancing if it was a profitable food source. So they follow this famous and very impressive waggle dance, where they can not only communicate the direction where the food source is, but also the distance. So it's basically communicating a vector, which is pretty amazing for an insect. And if they have another bee interested in that source, they can provide a nectar probe, and so the dance following bee is really well informed about what to expect at that food patch. They then will unload the nectar or pollen load, and then decide whether or not to collect another load from that food patch, or to try to find another potentially better food source, or they stop foraging at all. And these processes are then repeated a number of times, which reflects the weather conditions on that particular day. We also have a Varroa module in there, and that is mostly taken from Steve Martin's Varroa model, which he published in 2001. And it simulates the Varroa mites entering the brood cells just before, or the larval cells just before they are capped, and calculates the number of offspring mites. And this is important because Varroa mites can spread diseases like the deformed wing virus, which then affects the mortality or the lifespan of the bees. We can also have the APV, acute paralysis virus, in the model as well. However, not both at the same time. So the input you need to actually run the model, so as I mentioned before, you need the egg laying rate, which is coded in the actual code, but you can still modify it. And then you have some input options for the resources, the nectar and pollen resources. Also on the user interface, you can have two food sources, and you can define how much nectar and pollen is available and what the qualities of the nectar, so the sugar concentration, also the distances. But you can also read in more complex landscapes via an input file. And you can also define the foraging hours per day. And this is based on the max data from weather files, and based on the hours of sunshine on each day, given the maximum temperature is above a threshold value, in our case 15 degrees. In order to define a landscape and really load more or less realistic landscapes into the model, we developed the Bee Scout model. So Bee Scout reads in an image file, for example, a JPEG file, which represents a habitat map of the area you would like to simulate. And each color of those patches is linked to a certain habitat type. The image is then automatically analyzed. Patches are identified. It's identified where the position of those patches is, the distance to the colony, and also how big they are and how much nectar and pollen they provide at which time of the year. And all this information is then saved in a text file, which is then read in by the model. So you can really run the Behave model in a really existing landscape, in a real landscape. Of course, before the bees can actually exploit a food source, they first need to find it. And the probability to find a food source is also covered in the Bee Scout model. And the experimental data for that was collected at Rothamsted under Juliet Osborne with Alan Smith as an engineer, and they developed the harmonic radar. So you can put this little antenna, a transponder on the back of the bee, and then you have that radar system, and every 3 seconds, if you're lucky, you get a ping, and you know the exact location of the bee. And with that, you can actually see the flight paths of the bee, which is pretty cool, at least if everything goes all right. Quite often it doesn't go all right and the bee just disappears somewhere or loses its transponder. But if you do it often enough, you get a decent number of really nice flight patterns. And we then analyzed these patterns and tried to re-simulate them in the Bee Scout model. And from that, we can then simulate the detection probabilities. So the chance that a scout explores the landscape and finds a certain patch. And that also goes into the Behave model and informs the foraging module. So that's the input and the model, and now the output that is created by the model. That's just some standard output under the default setting. In the left graph, on the x-axis is the time, on the y-axis the colony size, and the dots are experimental data from literature, and the line shows the results from the Behave simulation. So we start in this example with 10,000 bees on the 1st of January. The population slowly declines over time, then it suddenly declines. This is when the first nice summer day or spring day occurs, and the bees actually go out foraging, and foraging is risky, so bees are likely to die. So population or colony size is actually first going down, but they also collect the honey and especially the pollen to raise the brood. So at some point, the colony is growing again, reaches its peak mid or end of summer, and then it's declining again, and the colony prepares for winter. On the right side, you see a similar graph, but for the brood, not for the adult workers. So that's just the output of the model without any empirical data. It is a similar curve, but you also see here that you occasionally have these very huge dips in the population size, in the number of pupae and larvae, and that is either caused because there are not enough nurse bees around, or because that's the more likely reason that the weather is bad or no pollen is available. And without pollen, the larvae don't get enough proteins, and they basically can't develop into pupae. And that if that happens, then the adult workers will actually start cannibalizing the eggs, or later even the larvae, in order to save or actually to recycle protein, and at least make sure that the older larvae make it and can develop into pupae. If you look into the mortalities, what actually drives these dynamics, you see that the most important factor, at least under these default settings, is the foraging probability. That's the reason where most bees, adult bees, die. Another reason why the colony is not always at its optimum is because the lack of nurse bees and the adjustment of the queen in terms of egg laying. So if the queen knows that the colony is too small, or the conditions are not well to raise the brood, then she will reduce the egg laying rate, which also means that the colony cannot grow with full speed, basically. And also lack of pollen, especially in spring, in early spring, can be an important factor affecting the colony dynamics. So do these results we modeled actually make sense? How do they compare with reality? This is a data set I got by Lloyd Harris after the model was published, and I was quite curious about that because I didn't look at these patterns before. So what you see here is the survival rate of cohorts of of bees over time. So on the x-axis is the age of the bees. On the y-axis, the relative survival probability. So basically, a number of bees, uh, all of the same age, were individually marked or were marked and put in observation hives, and then every day you check how many bees are left. And so you start with 100%, and then each day the cohort gets smaller and smaller. And what you see is that in spring, so in from April to summer, actually July, August, you see a pretty steep decline of the bees. So a relatively short lifespan, whereas from end of August onwards, the lifespan increases, which also makes sense because honeybees overwinter as a whole colony, and of course you need to have bees in spring which are still alive. I then try to resimulate that in the Beehive model, basically under default setting, and I got a pretty good match with the experimental data, so I was actually quite pleased with that result. And in the model, we don't address or don't implement specific winter bees, which show a different behavior than the summer bees, but it's all the same kind of foragers. The only difference in the model is that in winter, the bees go less often foraging because the weather conditions are bad, and that's sufficient to explain this pattern. Later, Amelie Schmolke and co-workers, they did a large-scale comparison of Beehive simulations and compared them with field experiments. They got the data from or tunnels. No, I think it was field experiments, and yeah, they published their validation study in a paper, and they found that there's a pretty good prediction of the Beehive within the first year. However, for the spring of the next year, it's not as good as before, but that's not really a surprise, I think. After the model was published, EFSA got interested in it. So that's the European Food Safety Authority, which regulates all things that are connected to food and food safety. And they suggested that so they actually set up a working group and finally published a 100 pages report. When I heard about that, I was pretty scared. But overall, it was relatively quite positive, the result, and they recommended that Beehive should be adopted as the basis of modeling the impact of pesticides and other stresses on honeybee colonies, so to be used in environmental risk assessment. Unfortunately, in the end, they didn't go for the Beehive model, but tried to develop their own model, which is currently still under development and not published yet and not available yet. Okay, so that was an overview of the Beehive model. I will now continue with the Bumblebee model, which is a bit similar to the Beehive model, but obviously addressing bumblebees. And in contrast to Beehive, it's not just simulating a single colony, but it's actually a population model. I will start with a quick overview of the bumblebee life cycle. So in contrast to honeybees, in bumblebees, only the queen overwinters, so they bury themselves in the ground. And because only the queen overwinters and hibernates throughout the winter, there are no big honey stores or no big nectar stores in bumblebee colonies found, in contrast to honeybees. In spring, then the queens emerge. They look for suitable nest site. They start to collect nectar and pollen, and once they have enough, they start egg laying and raise the first worker brood generation. When the workers are then emerged and ready to work, they will take over the work, meaning heating the brood nest, collecting nectar and pollen, while the queen then focuses on egg laying. And if the colony is successful, they will produce males and or females at the end of the season. They can then leave the colony, they mate. The queen then goes into hibernation and all the other bees die. And we basically recreated that life cycle in the model starting on the 1st of January again with hibernating queens and just follow that life cycle of the bumblebees. Again, I start with a short overview of the model structure. So we start with hibernating queens. It's parameterized for 6 UK species, but if you have the data, it's relatively easy to plug in new species. In spring, the queens emerge. They need to find a suitable nest site and start their own colony. Then explore the landscape, collect nectar and pollen, and then they lay a first batch of eggs. Eggs again develop into larvae and pupae into adults, and then the adults take over the work, care for the brood, or interact with the landscape. And from that, in the end, it's decided whether or not they can produce, or it's simulated the number of queens and males they are producing. And from that, if you run the model over multiple years, the population dynamic arises. And then finally, because it's a population model, and if the landscape provides enough resources, the carrying capacity of that landscape will be reached. Again, the model is implemented in NetLogo, and again, it uses a BEEscout model to provide the landscapes and inform the foraging module. Actually, simulating bumblebees is a bit more complicated and more tricky than simulating honeybees, because honeybees are super well organized. It's a big colony. Actually, in the Behave model, I don't really have a queen. I focus on the worker eggs, and I just distinguish between in-hive workers and adult and foragers. In bumblebees, it's all a bit more complicated because you cannot ignore the queen, because at the beginning there is only a queen, and the queen has to do a lot of work. So she has to, start with a nest, collect nectar and pollen, care for the brood, has to decide whether she wants to do egg laying or not. And so we have a bit more complex decision-making process where we base the division of labor on a stimulus threshold model. To develop to simulate the development of the brood, we again simulate or distinguish between eggs, larvae, pupae, and adults. All brood need incubation, and also they need, or at least larvae need, enough resources, nectar and pollen, within a certain time window. If they get what they need within a certain time frame, they will develop in the next stage and finally end up as adults. And then the size of the adult bees depends on how much pollen they have consumed as larvae. And that also affects how much nectar and pollen they can carry, how much energy they consume on the flight, but also how long their tongue is, which then affects the foraging efficiency. We also have to deal with caste determination, whether or not a diploid, so fertilized egg, develops into a worker bee or into a queen. So I don't know if you're aware of that. So in Hymenoptera, you have this haplodiploid system. So basically the fertilized eggs develop into females, and then it's decided whether it's a sterile female, which is a worker, or a reproductive female, which then becomes a queen. And the unfertilized eggs develop into larvae. Develop into male bees. And it's actually quite complicated process, and we try to mimic that in the model based on available publications. The foraging activities are very similar to the foraging activities in the Behave model. So if a bee decides, based on the stimulus threshold model, to go foraging, she will have to find a nest or a forage site, which again is based on detection probability from the BEEscout model. She will then collect nectar or pollen. Again, it is determined whether she survives the foraging trip based on the time she spent outside, and then she will unload and possibly do another task or keep continuing doing what she did. Obviously, for the bumblebees, we don't have a waggle dance. So all the foragers, themselves need to make their own experiences and find where the best food sources are available. They don't communicate it to their nest mates. And yeah, again, as I said, we use the B-Scout model to define landscape and also to determine detection probabilities. And in order to have an idea how much time the bees spend within the habitat, which is usually most of the time during a foraging trip is spent within the habitat, we found a model by Harder from 1983, which predicts or allows you to calculate the time a bee spends on a flower. And that actually depends on the tongue length of the bee and on the flower depth. And from that, you can calculate, and from the amount of nectar provided by that flower, you can calculate how much time a bee needs to spend within that patch to get a full crop load of nectar. If you then run the model for many years, you might get a result like that. So that's one of our experimental landscapes in Sussex, a 5 by 5 kilometer landscape with different habitat types. And each bumblebee you see here is actually reflecting or representing a single colony. You have some bars, colored bars on top of that bee, which reflects the colony composition and the number of bees present. If you run that model then for, let's say, 10 years, you can check the colony density, so colonies of per square kilometer, and compare that to data from literature, and they're relatively similar. Although actually finding bumblebee colonies in reality is also not very easy, and possibly or quite likely their numbers are underestimated in publications. So that's an introduction of the models, and so we now have the models. How can we actually apply them, and not just we, but other researchers as well. So the bumblebee behave model as well as the behave model is publicly available, so everyone can download it, everyone can use it. They don't need to ask permission, they just download the model and do whatever they want to do with it. And occasionally you then see an interesting publication of someone who used the model. Fabrice Riquet, for example, he used the behave model to simulate the impact of the yellow-legged hornet, Vespa velutina, which really causes problem in large areas or regions in France. So that's an invasive species, and particularly in late summer, they're hovering in front of the entrance. They pick up the foragers when they leave the hive and eat them, which then results in the bees not going out anymore, which then ultimately leads to the starvation of the colony in winter because they haven't managed to collect enough honey stores. And yeah, he did simulations with the behave on Vespa velutina. Juliana Horn did her PhD on the behave model. She was particularly interested in the landscape composition and forage gaps, and what happens if no resources are available for a certain amount of time, and how the bees can cope with that. The behave model has also been used by industry, for example, to simulate the impact of pesticides. So the original behave version doesn't have a explicit pesticide module in there, but there are still ways to implement the effects of pesticides on the bees, for example, by increasing the foraging mortality if a foraging bee goes to a certain crop that was treated with pesticides. In the meantime, so in 2022, actually explicit pesticide module was published by Preuss et al. And so that's also covered now in the latest behave version. Laura Balson used the behave model to simulate the impact of antibiotics. So occasionally beekeepers treat their bees with antibiotics, for example, against American foul brood, but that does not only kill the bacteria they are trying to get rid of, but also can disturb or kill the gut microbiome and really disturb it of the bees. And she's under various assumptions simulated what happens to the bees after antibiotic treatment. Also, EFSA used recently, or a couple of years ago, the BEHAVE model to simulate the background mortality of honeybees, actually over basically all of Europe, as you can see on that little map on the right side, just to be able to define what is basically a normal colony mortality rate, to then contrast that to increased mortality rates caused by pesticides. Jessica Knapp was using the Bumble BEHAVE model during her PhD to see if courgettes can potentially be a profitable nectar source for bumblebees, and she found that early flowering courgettes can actually increase the number of bumblebee colonies available in the landscape, not so much the case for the late flowering um, late flowering courgettes, because that's already quite at the end of the season of the bumblebees. And then last year we published with colleagues an application of the Bumble BEHAVE models to study the impact of resource gaps. So basically, we're interested during the season do bumblebees really most rely on resources? And according to the model, that's actually just after colony establishment, so relatively early in the season in spring, so around March and April, so more or less around this time of the year. So if you now think, okay, that actually sounds quite interesting, can we use the model? Can I use them for whatever you would like to do with the model? So as I said before, all the BEHAVE models are freely available on our BEHAVE website. They come with a complete documentation, very well description of what the model is doing, why the model is doing it. It comes with manuals, and we tried really hard to get a user-friendly interface where you see all what's going on. You have input things, you have buttons you can press. You can also easily access the code and modify the code and yeah, use and apply the model for whatever you want to use it. So, and that's true for the BEHAVE model and also for the Bumble BEHAVE model. And you also can use the BeeScout model if you're interested in creating input files from real habitat maps for your modeling approach. Amelie Schmolke is now also a colleague of mine at Rifcon, and she has developed and published recently a solitary bee model, which is also, I think, freely available. So basically, we now have interesting models for all three big bee groups. And Sol BPOP is also implemented in NetLogo. And yeah, NetLogo is also freely available. It was developed as a research tool or teaching tool, and it's really easy to use. And the code is quite easy to read and to understand. For I just added here a little example where I ask foragers with bringing nectar, with the activity bringing nectar, if a random number is below a foraging mortality risk, then the bee dies. So I think that's pretty easy to understand, even if you are not an experienced modeler or programmer. And the NetLogo platform also comes with tutorials and a lot of interesting example models. So even if you're not interested in bees, might be worth checking out the NetLogo website and have a look. And I think with that, I'm actually coming to, reaching the end of my talk. Just to mention, if you give it a go, if you tried out the models, if you get stuck, don't hesitate to send me an email. Of course, I can't do the modeling for you, but I'm always happy to help you with if you get stuck, and we'll send you a reply. With that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. Really nice to see all the different modules explained and the different Asian-based models. I do have one question, and then we'll move to the broader audience. So in terms of the temperature, so we're as we were discussing before the talk started, we experience large temperature swings. Um, and so often, so I do a lot of modeling in like ordinary differential equations, and then
Mhm.
these very jagged things can affect the solution of the curve. Um, so in your model, how well does it take in these temperature swings that like is it going to be affected
Mhm.
by the jaggedness?
Well, actually, the model itself does not really take temperature into account. Would be nice, but that would have been too complicated. Um, Temperature affects the daily foraging hours. So basically determines whether or not the bees can go out foraging. And yes, it then can really, particularly if you have a cold weather spell, then you have a couple of nice days of sunshine, bees go out foraging, then it gets getting cold again, the bees stop foraging. So it can really cause some peaks in the egg laying rate and in the development of the bees. It's indirectly affecting the amount um, of energy they have to spend on thermoregulation, but that's based on an average temperature assumption, so it's not affected by real temperature variation.
Okay, okay. I just wanted to comment that the EFSA component is kind of interesting. I'm doing something similar, not on bees, but with
Oh yeah,
a Canadian government entity. And even with the level of approvals, if they want to use my stuff, it's taking a long time for just getting approvals. So
yeah.
it's interesting that they're doing that, but whatever. Um, okay, so we can move to questions. So reminder that if you have a question, you can feel free to type it into the Q&A, though we can also allow people to ask questions. Um, and so there's a question in the Q&A that I'll read to you. It says, how can these models be used by decision makers in crop protection, production, registration process? Are there any examples of this in Europe?
So at the moment, these models are not used in the regulatory process yet. Um, so as I mentioned before, EFSA is currently developing their own honeybee model called Apis rum, and once that is finished, that might be approved for being used in risk assessment officially. Nevertheless, I mean these models can be used to um, to simulate the impact of pesticides and inform the users um, if there are any issues to be expected.
I can imagine that. So I have a relative whose business is in helping farmers determine what crops they should plant each year. And I think it would be interesting to see with Behave, just with the changing of the crop that's planted, even just on wild bees that will be in the area, how that's going to affect their resource
Mm.
levels.
Yeah, so when we developed the Behave model, we had beekeepers in mind and made tried to make it user-friendly for beekeepers. And then for the Bumble Behave model, we then later developed a new version, or basically it's the same model, but it has a new interface and few more features called Bee Steward, and that was particularly designed for landowners, particularly people, yeah, having a small farm and would be happy to dedicate a certain plot or whatever to bees and to inform them how to best or what to make the best use of that plot of land and to play around what happens if I add these and that, yeah, wildflowers or whatever, and how does it affect the bumblebee population in the model. And we also then provided some workshops to, yeah, work closely with farmers and, yeah, inform them and help them using the model.
Cool, thank you. Um, there's another question in the Q&A. So the question is, the model is the model flexible enough that it can be used with the purpose to test some pollinator protection strategies?
Yes, I think it is. So of course it depends a bit on the question, but I think the models are simulating in great detail forage availability, for example. So any changes to the landscape, any changes to nectar and pollen resources, also availability through the out of the season because of weather conditions. That's all very well covered by the models.
So have you, for me, so I'm
Yeah.
interested in also competition. Um, so when you're looking at the different models, have you ever combined them together so that you have like different types of bees all in the same area?
I was thinking of that. I was trying to combine the Behave model and the Bumble Behave model to really, yeah, for example, model how does honeybee colonies affect the bumblebee population, for example. But unfortunately, got stuck in the yeah, probably not even beta version. Um,
Yeah,
would be really interesting to do that. I tried it in the end, didn't have the time and had to move on.
understandable. I have lots of projects that are like
Yeah.
that. Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from the attendees? If not, thank you so much for coming to give us this talk. I'm sure that a lot of the attendees will be checking out the software and will be in touch if we have questions. Oh, there's another question. So this will be the last question and then we
Yeah.
can sign off. So most of the scientific literature related with bees, particularly honeybees, is published from experiments in temperate regions. What do you think about the tropical areas' behavior of bees?
That's a very good question. So also the Behave model is mainly parameterized with Central Europe, UK data. So it has been applied in Australia. I'm aware of that. I was involved in a project in South America where I wanted to apply the Behave models. Unfortunately, thanks to Corona, that didn't really happen. Um, so yes, in principle, I think it would be feasible to apply the models in other um, yeah, tropical regions or in other areas, but you definitely have to modify them. You definitely have to modify the egg-laying pattern, for example, and you probably have to modify the behavior of the bees in terms when they actually go out foraging. So you can't just take the um, that 50 hours of sunshine when it's above a certain threshold. I think that will not work if the temperatures are just getting too high for the bees to forage, things like that. So in principle, yes, you should be able to do that, but you need to adjust the models.
Okay, thank you very much for coming.
Yeah. Thank you
Hope you
very much
have a
for the
good,
invitation. It was my pleasure.
and thank you so much for joining us on a Friday night. I know that those are special times. Thank you very much and have a great weekend. And I will
Thank
turn
you.
the webinar back to Catherine for closing remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye bye.
Yep. Thank you very much, Matthias. It was a great talk. I don't
Thank
have
you.
much to say other than thank you everyone for joining us for our last talk for this semester. And we'll reconvene back in fall 2025. Thank you.